v'taher libeinu, v'taher libeinu le'avdecha be'emet, v'taher libeinu, v'taher libeinu, v'taher libeinu le'avdecha be'emet. V'taher libeinu, v'taher libeinu, v'taher libeinu le'avdecha be'emet, v'taher libeinu, v'taher libeinu, v'taher libeinu le'avdecha be'emet. Shalom, welcome back everyone. Great to see y'all. Great to see that y'all got the message from either last Wednesday or last night that we're meeting at our special time tonight. It's Sunday evening rather than Wednesday. We'll see if others join us, but for now, I'm excited to bring on session number 4 of our 6-part series, the first of our sessions on the Amidah. And I want to give some gratitude to the generosity of the D. Dan and Betty Kahn Foundation, whose support has enabled this program to happen, and of course to the generosity of viewers and prayers like you. So to start us off, as we always do, with a bit of Q&A review a little bit, we'll just open it up. Anyone, what questions do you have about the Shema? I hope that you got some practices in of saying the Shema and its blessings. But let's hear it. What are some questions that you're still holding about the Shema? Yeah, Victoria, start us off.
So I know the answer is yes to the basic question in terms of the silent or the softer part of the Shema. When do we not recite that? So I'm in shul and we say the Shema together. Am I saying that to myself then? I am. Okay.
Yeah, so the Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto Leolam Va'ed, the words, the 6-word phrase that follows Shema Yisrael. Yeah, that's said at home and at synagogue, and just in the same way you would do it the same way at home or in synagogue, that Shema Yisrael is said out loud. And before Ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha, you'll have a moment for a quiet Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto Leolam Va'ed. And people may be whispering it or even saying it so low that you might not even hear them. But
and I haven't, and that's why I was unsure whether I say it in synagogue or not. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Good question. And I see, Sarah, you've got your hand up.
Thanks, Jake. This has been such a wonderful class. I just wanted to say, and you know, I feel like there are things that I should have learned a long time ago that I'm finally learning. So thank you so much. I grew up in a Reformed synagogue, and we learned nothing. I mean, I don't recall learning anything, you know, about how to pray as a Jew. So this is great. And I was just wondering about the Shema. I mean, does it have like a mystical dimension, a mystical practice? I mean, do some people use it like as a mantra, or is it like to the Kabbalists? I mean, does it have, I mean, I feel like it should be like really powerful. It should be, you know, sort of a formula about reality. And It should be something that could have a lot of, transformative effect and not just be like a certain thing that happens like once or twice a day. Or, I mean, I know I'm saying the obvious here, but I sort of thought maybe you could talk about that a minute if you chose to. But thank you anyway for everything.
Yeah, absolutely. So first, I'll just say that it's great of you to share about how, even despite growing up in a Jewish community, you didn't learn much about prayer. And I was just talking with my partner Nina about this, how so much of Judaism is learned through kind of imitating what the people around you are doing, which is great and a time-honored thing, and that's kind of how it should be. But the challenge is that if you never also have the time and space to go back and do a deeper dive and figure out the hows and whys, you're kind of only scratching the surface. And so, yeah, so about that, the Shema and its mystical elements, definitely. Certainly, people can use it as a kind of meditative mantra. It's as you're correctly intuiting, it is absolutely a statement that is quite impactful and transcendent. You're talking about the ultimate reality that Adonai is one. The mystics tend to understand that to mean, because when we say that God is one, we don't just mean that God is one, because God is the absolute, is the fundamental reality in which all things are contained. And so it's not just that God out there, there's only one of them, but it's that the whole fabric of the universe is an inextricable unity. So there's definitely um, a rich kind of body of thought and practice around that. And yeah, as I sort of mentioned last time, part of the one Kabbalistic approach sees that when we say Shema, we're actually uh, uniting sort of the lower, more immanent aspect of God with the higher, more transcendent aspect of God. So there's kind of a God that we feel down here, and there's a God out there. And when we say that God is one, we are actually helping to create that healing within God that is the purpose of our existence. So there's a lot there.
Yeah, I'd forgotten you had mentioned that. That's really awesome. Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, yeah, and so it takes on, for the mystics, it becomes extremely important that you have the proper concentration and attention, because you're
Mhm.
not just saying words, you're actually
Yeah,
doing things in the divine level.
nice.
Yeah. Okay, Roz, you got a question or comment?
Yeah, just a very quick comment to what Sarah said, and then my question. I grew up in an Orthodox congregation, and prayer was um, all in Hebrew, always. There was never transliteration, there was never translation. It was a synagogue that was composed primarily of Holocaust survivors from Germany, and so our Siddurim had German translation, not English. And I was actually the only child in the synagogue who could actually read it because my parents taught me German at an early age. But no one else could, none of the other children. And so it really wasn't until I joined Tehillah many years ago that I began to really comprehend what these prayers were and meant, and and it the whole thing became much more meaningful to me rather than just praying by rote, so to speak. So that was just my comment to you. Question, I may have missed this last time, Jake. I know that the second line after the Shema is said on Yom Kippur, correct? Yes. And so my question is, why is that day different from every other day, right? So why is it said on Yom Kippur and not out loud and not at other times or on other special days?
Yeah, great question. So I think that the tradition that I have heard is that that formula, Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto Le'olam Va'ed, is actually an angelic prayer. And so at various points in the liturgy, you see that our liturgy has these kinds of quotations where these moments where they describe, oh, the angels up on high, they are turning left and right, and they're singing sweet songs, and they're saying, and oftentimes it's kadosh, 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 holy, holy, holy is Adonai, but there's variations on it as well, and that come up in other prayers. And it's sort of said that this Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto is an angelic prayer from on high. And so somehow humans became privy to this prayer and tap into its celestial power in our daily worship. But it's sort of inappropriate, or it's sort of improper for humans to be uttering this angelic prayer. So we do it in a whisper, except on Yom Kippur, which is a day in which we're said to be akin to angels because of our elevated state of holiness and our pardon from our transgressions and things like that.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe do we have one more question about Shema before we move on to tonight's subject? Or it can be about anything we've covered, not just Shema. Okay, well, as always, if you have further questions, feel free to put them in the chat, and periodically I'll be soliciting questions from y'all through tonight's session. And then, of course, I do want to invite folks that after we formally close at 8:30, if you want to stick around for a few moments, I'll turn off the recording and you can ask all the controversial questions. Okay. So this should be familiar, that we have our sort of 5-part structure of the prayer service. And so we've covered a bit about the warm-up portion. Last week we tackled the Shema. Tonight and next week we'll be dealing with the Amidah. And here's our schedule once again. Tonight we'll be focusing more on the basics of the Amidah, the choreography, sort of what you say, how you say it, what you're supposed to do while you say it. Next week we'll get a bit more into the content and the spiritual component of it. So this week we're focusing more on the keva, the structure, and next week we'll focus more on the kavanah, the intention. And a couple of things to say about tonight's focus on the Amidah is that you've probably, if you've been to synagogue services of any kind, perhaps with the exception of humanistic Judaism, you've encountered the Amidah. And you may have heard an Amidah chanted out loud, or you may have heard the silent Amidah or participated in the silent Amidah. And chances are, if you're anything like me or most people, you've been in the situation at least once where they've said, and now time for the silent Amidah, and you don't know what's going on. All of a sudden, there was a lot of praying out loud, and all of a sudden there's no praying, and okay, I'm supposed to be silent. Am I supposed to be doing something? People are bowing, people are sitting. Am I supposed to be sitting? I don't know. So there's lots of questions that are totally understandable for beginners and seasoned practitioners alike. So we'll hope to shed light on some of that. And I'll just kind of quickly say that indeed, even when the cantor or rabbi or the shaliach tzibor, the prayer leader, says, silent Amidah, indeed, there is liturgy in the siddur to be said at that point. Of course, in plenty of communities, such as Techia, we say something like, use the words of the siddur or the words of your heart to connect in a way that's meaningful for you. But tonight, what we'll be focusing on is a bit of that structured liturgy. Okay, so a little bit of reading just to give us a bit of tradition and information and context for what we mean when we're talking about the Amidah. Okay, could I invite a reader to read this quote from Rabbeinu Bachya, who is a medieval Yeah, Lee, go for it.
Sorry, I won't be able to read later, so I want to do it while I can still unmute. Sorry. You should know that from the days of Moshe Rabbeinu until the period of the men of the Great Assembly, prayer in Israel was not arranged in a definite order for everyone alike. Each individual prayed for himself according to his knowledge, wisdom, and clarity of expression. This was the general practice until the men of the Great Assembly ordained the Amidah, so that there would be a set of prayer for all the people of Israel alike.
Thank you. Yeah, so we see this kind of medieval commentator, Rabbeinu Bachya, in his book Kat HaKemach, The Flour Jar. Great little title of a work there. He's saying that, you know, in the ancient times, from the Bible till about the Second Temple and that sort of era, certainly by the rabbinic era, that prayer was not a set and structured thing. Everyone prayed, I love this, according to their knowledge, wisdom, and clarity of expression. So people who, were not so clear when they spoke, their prayers reflected that. And then eventually there comes a time when the men of the Great Assembly set standard prayer so that actually everyone's going to say the same things instead of just praying according to their capacity. Okay, so let's keep that in mind, and we'll read another reading which will just kind of give a little bit of context for and a little bit of additional historical context for something we've touched upon before, but is really rather foundational to understanding the structure of Jewish prayer and a bit of the hows and whys of it, which is the shift from sacrifice to prayer. Could I get a reader for this reading? Yeah, Victoria. You are muted.
Oh, I thought I unmuted. I'm sorry. Didn't quite click hard enough. One monumental accomplishment of the men of the Great Assembly was the formulation of a universal Jewish prayer service. Today, the centerpiece of every service is the prayer known as the Amidah, literally the standing prayer. And its attendant prayers were apparently absent in the First Temple, era 957 to 586 before the Common Era. The need for such a formalized prayer only first arose when Jews went into exile in Babylon 597 to 539 before the Common Era. And during the exile, the communal experience of the 3 times a year pilgrimage to the temple left a vacuum. Without the temple, essential nutrients in the people's religious diet were lacking. Therefore, the leaders in Babylon codified a system of prayer that substituted for the temple service. They based this on the prophetic verse, "Our lips will substitute for sacrifices," Hosea 14:3. When the Jews returned from Babylon to the land of Israel and rebuilt the temple, they brought along with them the prayers they had learned in Babylon. The men of the Great Assembly arranged, placed in order, edited, and formulated the words of the Amidah, as well as its accompanying prayers. The arrangement continued through the entire Second Temple era and has continued until today. Although the individual synagogue system was inferior, it successfully compensated for the shift in Jewish life away from the centralized temple system. Now, with the stamp of approval from the men of the Great Assembly, Jewish prayer became possible in each community by each individual, no matter how far away she was. Instituting prayer this way was not only substituted for the temple service, but compensated for the loss of the central place in Jewish life. Rabbi Beryl Wen, overview of the Amidah.
Great. So that gives a little bit of the historical framework that goes on in this shift from sacrifice to prayer. We also learned a few things that Amidah means standing, Omed, la'amod, to stand. This is also what is said when someone goes up for a Torah aliyah. They're called to the Torah. Ta'amod, ya'amod, na la'amod, that kind of thing. Come, stand up. he's referring a bit to this bit of Jewish history about the Babylonian exile, which is a very formative moment in Jewish history, and you'll find was only about 60 years. So that's a little interesting if you know about Jewish history, is that this thing, the exile, was a rather short-term thing. But so we have this replacement, and as he says, it's not only a substitute, but it's also it compensates for the loss of the temple as well, filling people's spiritual appetite to give prayer. I'll just point out also, this Rabbi Beryl Wine is an Orthodox rabbi, and sort of variously modern Orthodox or variously from, sometimes he's more modern, sometimes he's more Haredi, like ultra traditional. And so when he says that although the individual synagogue system was inferior to the temple, I'm not sure that all Jews today would believe that. I'm not sure that all Jews today would believe that animal sacrifice is a good way to connect to God versus gathering in local communities in conversation and study. But the context is still useful. Okay. So we'll go from here into a bit of fast facts. Oh, before we get into these fast facts, any questions on what we've covered so far?
I mean, I just don't buy that, you know. I think that, like, I mean, this is it's just such cheapo history. Like, first of all, I mean, how do they know that? You know, you didn't know what was going on then, you know, in the Babylonian exile. And then, you know, basically all over the world, right? People used to sacrifice. I mean, not just the Jews, the Greeks did it, you know, the Hindu, you know, I mean, it's just, it's a very profound transition, you know, in the human consciousness and whatever. I mean, it's fine. It's pretty shallow and, you know, made up, but whatever, you know, it's fine. I mean, it just seems so, I think it's profound to say that the Amidah substitutes for sacrifice, for an animal sacrifice. I mean, that is like kind of amazing, you know, but at the same time, you know, it's just sort of this cute little thing. It seems like something you'd read in like in one of those, you know, Libby's kind of, you know, Pesach Seder, or sort of just this little cheesy thing, but whatever. So I'm sorry. I just,
Yeah, no, I get it. I think, yeah. So this is, I think what you're pointing to is that there is an interesting tension here, that sacrifice and prayer are vastly different ways of approaching God and practicing religion. Part of what we're seeing is that there's you know, if we think about sort of what else is going on in the world around, you know, in the 6th century BCE, and we're seeing a shift towards and a growth in philosophy and stuff like that. So people are becoming a bit more interior, a bit more focused uh, on speculative matters and philosophical matters. And so I think you might be onto something that I don't think the history is as linear as this cute version purports. Because really, I think what it is a matter of competing religious tendencies. And that's something that if you look into the history of the Second Temple, there's a lot of that where the Sadducees are this kind of sect that's very invested in the temple service, and the Pharisees, which we now, thanks to Christianity, interpret as a kind of insult. But the Pharisees, the rabbis, basically, are more interested in prayer and study than temple stuff. So there is kind of a competing religious approaches that are going on. And ultimately, you know, with the destruction of the Second Temple, this rising institution of prayer becomes all the more potent. Okay, good comments though. So let's look into some of these fast facts on the Amidah. So the Amidah, so we talked about with the Shema, that the Shema is said twice a day, or 3 times it's said in the Ma'ariv service and Shacharit. and you might say an additional Shema at bedtime. The Amidah, however, is said 3 times a day, every service, whether it's Shabbos or weekdays. You're saying this at each of the prayer services. Those communities that practice Musaf, the additional service, the Amidah is said in Musaf as well. The Amidah, for the reasons that we've just talked about, the Amidah is the centerpiece of Jewish prayer. So I would say sort of along with the Shema, they sort of serve different purposes, that the Shema is the declaration of God's unity, and the Amidah is sort of us approaching God, us approaching the divine. It is the centerpiece of Jewish prayer. It's so central that when it's talked about in the Talmud, the rabbis call it ha-tefillah, the prayer. So when they're talking about, oh yeah, what should we do how should we say the prayer? They mean the Amidah. Amidah, as we talked about, means standing. So it's the standing prayer. That's one of its most, I would say probably that's its most common name. The Amidah, Ha-Amidah, the standing prayer. Of course, in sensitivity and to various body types and abilities and things like that, we recognize that not everyone who's saying it is going to be standing, and that's all good. Another name for it is the Shmone Esrei. Can you raise your hand if you heard this term, Shmone Esrei? Yeah, some folks, it seems to register with some folks. Certainly in more traditional communities, traditional or Orthodox or sort of traditionally observant communities, Shmone Esrei is a common name for it. And Shmone Esrei means 18. And it's called 18 because, well, you would think that because there are 18 blessings, but tradition had actually added an extra blessing. So even if you're saying the normal weekday Amidah, that's 19 blessings. You still call it Shmone Esrei, but there's 19 of them. Interestingly, the 19th blessing is one that is about, may the informers be punished. May the people who are pretending to be Jews, who are sort of sabotaging us, may the informers, the minim, and all of the wicked folk be punished. And so it kind of makes sense why the authorities wanted to keep that one on the down low. So they said, no, there's 18. It's the 18 blessings plus this one against the bad people. We'll talk next week about the summoning the proper kavanah for that bracha. I'll just read through these next bullet points, and then we'll do a few questions. So this prayer, as the reading sort of said, this prayer has been fixed since about 400 in the Common Era, the year 400. So that's pretty early in terms of contemporary Judaism. I would say that's early in Judaism. It's sort of middle stage of history for when we're talking about Torah, ancient Israelite religion, the temple. But 400 is pretty early in Judaism, rabbinic Judaism. Remember that the Mishnah, the code of Jewish law, comes in around 200. Okay. The Amidah, as we've talked about, involves bowing and other choreography. There's a little bit when we say Kadosh, 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 where you raise up on your tippy toes 3 times. I don't think there's a word for that besides tippy toes. But that's some of the choreography. We'll talk about that tonight. And there are elements that look different alone or with a minyan, which is something we talked about with the Baruch Hu for the Shema. There's parts of the Amidah that are said, only said with a minyan, and parts that are said differently depending on if you're praying alone or with a minyan. And there's also some differences between weekdays and Shabbat. Okay, those are some fast facts. Let's hear some questions. Victoria, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I'm really curious when the 19th blessing was added, but I'm going to guess it's when the American Reform movement started.
I
Just
think that was
kidding,
a
just kidding.
tongue-in-cheek comment, but I think actually it's I think it was added around 400. I think it was Hillel the Younger who did the kind of sealing everything up neatly with a bow, and I think that he did include the al-haminim, the blessings on the informers. Yeah, so internecine struggle is uh, totally part of Jewish history from the beginning. It's a history of sects and schisms and all kinds of stuff like that. Yeah, Mary?
So where does the silent Amidah fit in? Because I actually, until now, I always thought that's what the Amidah was the silent part of the basic prayer service.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't realize that a lot of these other, like, the patriarchs and the matriarchs and everything was part of the Amidah.
Yeah, that's a great point. So that was also my experience growing up, going to Tat Shabbat. They would say, okay, and now there's the silent Amidah, and we would just sit in silence. And I thought, okay, this is cool. And I didn't know that there was things that were supposed to be said during that time. So the silent Amidah, I would say that there's two kind of parts of it. One is that in traditional services, the Amidah is said by all individuals who are there in a very hushed tone, such that it's effectively silent. You may hear some quiet mumbles, but there's a tradition that says it should be loud. You should say it loud enough that you can hear it, but quiet enough that others can't. So you're kind of doing this davening through the liturgy by yourself. That's part of where the silent Amidah comes from. In traditional services, there's the silent Amidah that everyone says on their own, and then there's a recitation that is said out loud by the cantor or the person leading services. So that's part of it, that in traditional practice, the Amidah involves people saying it to themselves, and then there's a group recitation. But then another part of it is that following the structured blessings of the Amidah, which we'll look at in just a moment, that time is an opportunity for private prayer. And so it's sort of like once you get done with all of the blessings that you need to say, you're in a state of, you're thought to be in a state of extra closeness with the divine. You sort of have the direct link with the divine, with your conversations with God. And so that time is where you fill in all your prayers about praying for everything else that you haven't prayed for yet, or having a little bit of extra basking in relationship with God following the prayers. And so in a lot of communities that employ less of the traditional liturgy, we might start off with a group recitation of the Amidah and go right into a silent, finishing the Amidah silently, and that time is variously used by people for either doing the words of the Siddur or kind of a silent meditation. Unfortunately, especially in communities that are less ritually heavy, or that are less reliant on the traditional liturgy, there's often not that much time allotted for the Amidah. And so you'll see that there's actually plenty of liturgy to be said during that period. And unfortunately, a lot of communities, for various reasons, don't allot that much time such that people can actually work through all 19 blessings on a weekday or however many it is on Shabbat. Does that make sense? Great. Any other questions before we go into the specific blessings of the Amidah and the format and that kind of stuff? All right. So, what are the blessings? So we know that there's 18 or 19 on the weekday. And these are, we start off with 3 blessings of praise. There's kind of 3 sections of the prayer. The first section is praise. We're praising God. The next section, which on a weekday involves 13 brachas, and on Shabbat just involves 1, is on a weekday we've got 13 blessings that are asking for things. We're asking for rain, we're asking for healing, we're asking for justice, we're asking for the ingathering of exiles and all kinds of stuff like that. We'll get into that in a moment. But on Shabbat, it's replaced with just 1 blessing. So on Shabbat, we're really not asking for things. We're praying, we're basking in the holiness of Shabbat. And so we have a blessing that acknowledges that. And then it closes, the third section is there are 3 blessings of thanksgiving. Not the holiday, but the giving of thanks. 3 blessings of gratitude. So that's our kind of tripartite structure for understanding what all that is. And here's just a few examples of what our praises are about, and what the various sections contain. But we'll actually go through this sort of line by line with what are all of these blessings. Okay, so here we are, 19 blessings, Weekday Amidah. Again, this is basically the same liturgy, whether you're saying it in the morning, the afternoon, or the evening. There are a couple variations where, in the evening you say this prayer for this blessing, and in the morning you say a different one. But this is our structure. So we'll just talk through it, because I think for a lot of people this is something they haven't explored before. Okay, so we start off with the blessing for the ancestors, avot, our fathers, or our ancestors, avot ve'imot, our fathers and mothers. This is the blessing that if you've been to a synagogue service, you've probably heard, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu ve'Elohei avotenu ve'imotenu, Elohei Avraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Elohei Yaakov, Elohei Sarah, Elohei Rivka, Elohei Rachel, ve'Elohei Leah. It goes on from there. So that's invoking all of those spiritual ancestors. So it's not just all of our ancestors and all of our tradition, but the prime forefathers and foremothers, patriarchs and matriarchs. We move from there into a section called Gevurot, the powers. This is the section that ends with Baruch atah Adonai mechayeh kol chai. That's in Reconstructionist. That says, "Blessed are you, Adonai, who gives life to every living thing." But the traditional blessing says, Mechayeh hametim, who gives life to the dead. And this is because the traditional Jewish belief, still maintained in Orthodox Judaism today, is that when the Messiah comes, God will revive the dead. And so Reconstructionism rejected that belief that, there will be a day when there's a Redeemer who comes and the dead will all be revived. And so instead there's a liturgical substitution, but you may have seen either of them. There's a blessing for the holiness of God. I love this one in the traditional liturgy. It says, Ata kadosh v'shimcha kadosh ukdoshim b'chol yom yehalelucha selah. You are holy and your name is holy, and the holy ones praise your name all day. Whew. It's just a great little thing. And so that blessing, when said individually, is this holiness blessing. And as a group, that's where this thing called the Kedusha comes in. But rather than get into the weeds about each and every one of these blessings, I'll just kind of scan through them and say if there's anything that I feel like pointing out. So we have a blessing for Bina, for understanding, sort of intellect, understanding. A blessing on Tshuva that says, forgive us, Adonai, for we have sinned in this way and that way. People even do the sort of beating the heart for that blessing, which you may be familiar with from Yom Kippur services. There's a blessing for Geula, for redemption, Refuah, for healing, during which you can insert the names of people that you're praying for healing. There's a blessing for resources, really for rain, but people kind of interpret it as material resources. This is one that changes throughout the year. In winter, we pray for rain, and in summer, we pray for dew. And that's sort of, coming from the ecology of the Levant, of the Near East, the land of Israel and that area. Traditionally, we have the Galuyot, the ingathering of exiles. May all the people who've been scattered throughout the earth be brought together. May the next blessing says that really may the judges be restored. In ancient Israel, in the Bible, before there were kings, whenever there were kings in the land, there were problems. Monarchy led to problems. If you read the books of the prophets and the writings, there's always trouble with kings. So instead, we pray for a return to the system of judges, of having, which really were kind of like chieftains of some sort, but there's an attitude of, we want wise people ruling us. Then snuck in there is blessing number 12, against the informers, against the enemies, which has some great, you'll look at translations and you'll find words like cast down the wanton sinners and things like that. So great kind of biblical justice. Praying for the tzaddikim, so you pray against the enemies, but for the longevity of the righteous people. And then in traditional Amidah, there's things like rebuilding Jerusalem, restoring the Davidic line of monarchy. So there's a little bit of tension there, that you're praying for judges, but you're also praying for a restoration of the Davidic line, the King David, from whom the Messiah is said to descend. Then you're praying that God will hear your prayers, which is a pretty good thing to pray for while you are praying. May the prayer be successful. There's a prayer about the worship itself, about the avodah, a prayer of thanksgiving, and a prayer for peace. So pretty extensive. It covers a lot of bases. Obviously, not everything you could ever pray for is in there. Nothing about love. Nothing about getting a good grade on your upcoming test or things like that. But there might be ways to interpret the tradition to fill that. I see. Yeah, Robin, you got a question or comment?
Yeah, for number 5, Teshuva, what does that mean? What does return mean in this context of petitions?
That's excellent. Yeah, so this word teshuva, sort of literally means return. It's most often translated, however, as repentance. And I think that that's probably a more accurate translation in this context, to say repentance, because the lines of the prayer say something to the effect of, forgive us, God, for we have sinned. Pardon us, God, for we have transgressed. That sort of thing. But the sort of bracha that closes it, Baruch atah Adonai, I think it's Rotse Tshuva, who desires repentance. So yeah, so good, helpful clarification there. Thank you. Any other questions on this? Yeah, Mary.
Why in the Siddur is none of it transliterated? So yeah, and also it's not laid out like this, like there are like that's a list. It doesn't look like a list at all, and it's not described in the the commentary that way, or at least I don't see it. I'm just looking. This was always like a total dead spot in the entire service to me because of that. It's all in Hebrew.
That's a great point. Yeah, so a couple things about that. So pretty much that comes down to a publication choice. So if you're looking at Kol HaNeshama, the Reconstructionist Siddur, you're right that a lot of it is not transliterated. So we have, for example, so some of them, I think they do actually put the heading of the bracha on so that it says like, number 3 says Kedushat Hayom. It's about blessing the.
But yeah, I didn't notice that it was numbered like that.
Yeah, right. So some Siddurim do actually do a good job at numbering. Not all of them do. These are kind of traditional headings, so a lot of Siddurim do actually employ these kinds of headings to say, okay, we're on Givurot, and then you kind of know, okay, that's the second blessing. But unfortunately, you're right that like a lot of even the Reconstructionist Siddur is not fully transliterated. And I think that is, especially for the Amidah, I find that to be a very poor choice because I think that a lot of people would be so much more well empowered to pray and participate if they could read it in transliteration. So,
but it also only goes up to at least I know the Amidah appears in lots of places throughout the Siddur. So I was just looking at the very first one, so I didn't really look at all of them, but it only goes up to number 7.
Interesting. Are you in the Shabbat Siddur?
Yeah. On page 104. It goes up to 7 and then it goes into the concluding meditation. I mean, maybe, because there's lots of different.
Weren't you saying that 4 through 16 of these get replaced with just one prayer on Shabbat?
Yes, you got it. Yeah, so this is kind of there's a tension here kind of pedagogically in what I'm doing in that I want to be showing people about weekday prayer, not just about Shabbat, but what we're all inevitably most familiar with is Shabbat prayer. But yeah, whoever chimed in, I think that might have been Robin. You got it. That yes. So the middle 4 through 16 were omitted. So there were just 7. Although I'm kind of right, because it's 3 in the introduction, 1 that takes the place of the middle chunk. That's Kedushat Hayom, the holiness of the day, and then 3 in closing.
Right. Would it be possible for you to send us this slide by email?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So what I've been doing is that after each class, you'll get links to the video and the slides as well. And I can help out if any of the digital formatting is not so accessible. I'm happy to provide a simplified PDF or something. But yeah, sometimes it's useful even just to have this little cheat sheet, or if you want to have a little creative experience and build your own Amidah, perhaps relying on these traditional headings, you can say, what would I pray for in the realm of understanding, or what would I pray for in the realm of healing? That would be a cool way to get kind of sensitive to the movements of the prayer. Yeah, Sarah?
Well, sorry. So following along from Robin and what Mary were saying then, and what you were saying, so essentially, those of us who just attend the synagogue on Shabbat, which is, I mean, that's all I do. I've never just like shown up on a Wednesday morning, or I wouldn't even know where to go. So like, we don't really even get to hear any of this other stuff about Teshuva, Slicha, redemption, refuah, praying for the raising of the dead. I mean, none of that stuff happens. We're just in 1 through 3, then the Shabbat thing, and then we're into 17 through 19, right?
Yeah, that's correct.
Oh,
Yeah, so that
okay.
there you could
Mhm.
be someone who's gone to religious service, Jewish services, Shabbat services all your life.
And you never would know about this stuff. Wow.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's kind of shocking and strange, but yeah, thank you for
Yeah, and
sharing this with us.
it's also it points to a certain tension that arises that like one way that Jewish liturgy functions is that the Shabbat, one way that the Shabbat liturgy functions and holiday liturgy is through its difference from weekday liturgy. And so, you'd have no context for things that are especially said on Shabbat that are not said on weekdays if you don't engage with weekday prayer. Now, you know, I don't know about all of your communities. I mean, most of us are in the same community, but probably chances are that you're not going to weekday synagogue. Uh, Tahia so far doesn't have weekday services. So we're not alone in not being exposed to this. But I think that it's sort of important to get the context for even as we move more towards into the nuts and bolts. Okay. Yeah, let's take one more before we move on. Robin, you want to go for it?
Yeah, this is sort of a broader question since we're talking about kind of when we go to services. What in what types of communities would there still be regular weekday service? Like, obviously I know some of the answer to this, but not some of the more detail of like every community I've ever been a part of only has Shabbat services, and Dahia is one of those, as we're saying. So where would you go, as Sarah's saying, where would you go if you wanted to go to weekday services?
Yeah, so most Orthodox communities would have weekday services. A number of conservative ones, Reconstructionists as well. It's probably pretty rare to find a Reform community doing weekday services, um, but I'm happy to be wrong about that. I'm sure there are plenty of examples that would prove me wrong. But I would also say that in a number of communities across the denominational spectrum, one purpose of weekday minyan is to enable those who are saying Kaddish, who are in mourning, who need a minyan to say Kaddish, to help them get their fill in that sense. So yeah, so it's a thing, and yeah, it's out there, but yeah, certainly more on the more traditional side of the spectrum, you'll find.
So what you're saying is like any denomination can do it, but it kind of breaks down towards the more traditional and the way you'd expect it to.
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, it's basically like thinking about people's capacity and people's, how much does your Judaism pervade your everyday life, and are you uh, thickly connected with others who share in that level of commitment? Those are some of the variables that would inform it. Okay, well, let's get into the Amidah some more in terms of the nuts and bolts. So we're not just talking about the Amidah, but we'll actually get into how to do it, what it is. Okay, so we talked a little bit about this choreography. We'll spell it out for you. So, like we said, Amidah means standing. It's the standing prayer. So that's why we often say rise in body or spirit, because the standing is, traditionally central to the prayer. There's a little bit of choreography that precedes the Amidah, that opens the Amidah. It's a little shuffle. You take 3 steps backwards and then 3 steps forwards. So the idea is sort of, you're coming out of the space that you're in, entering into a new space. And a lot of people synchronize those 3 steps with the sort of preparatory phrase, Adonai Sfatai Tiftach, which means, Dear God, open my lips, Ufi Yagid Tehilatecha, that my mouth may declare your praise. So you take 3 steps back and 3 steps forward. Now, traditionally as well, you're supposed to be standing once you have your 3 steps forward with your feet totally together. So no, shoulder width apart. No, they're supposed to be totally together. One explanation is that it's supposed to emulate the foot of an angel, which is said to be a sort of fused thing.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, any questions about that so far? Standing, 3 steps back, 3 steps forward, feet together. Okay, and this is kind of this will be sort of a clue. I'll invite you to, I imagine very few of us are observing other people praying in person these days or able to see other people's feet. But the next time you're able to see some people's feet at a synagogue, take a look, see if people are standing with their feet totally together or a little more apart. Chances are the people who are standing with their feet totally together may have had some more exposure to more religiously traditional mode of worship, because that's considered a custom. It might be a halacha, it might be a law. But it's sort of the proper practice. Stand with your feet totally together. Now the bowing, this is a huge thing. People bow in the Amidah. And especially if you just think that people are doing the words of their heart and they're just shuckling and, getting into it and bowing all over the place, you may not know that there's actually 4 times in the Amidah when you're actually supposed to bow. It's not totally spontaneous. That kind of shuckling, which is a Yiddish word, is a great practice, a great kind of thing to do while you daven, but that part's not mandatory. So we'll get into bowing in just a moment. Tippy toes we talked about a little bit for the Kedusha. This is when you hear the words Kadosh, 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 Adonai Tzivaot Melech Kol Haaretz Kevodo, which means it's one of these moments in the liturgy where we're saying the angels up in heaven, they look left and right and they sing Kadosh, 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 holy, holy, holy is Adonai Tzivaot. God's glory fills the world. And so when you hear that Kadosh, 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 it's time to bounce on those tippy toes. 3 times. Sorry, 3 times. Now, to close the Amidah, there is some more bowing with Oseh Shalom and another 3 steps back and 3 steps forward. So that's kind of your way of bookending this transition. You're transitioning into a sacred space. And for those of you who believe in God, who are more theistically inclined, this is really the time when you take those steps forward to feel that you're really coming into the presence of God, that you are stepping into a greater level of holiness, entering into conversation and prayer. So let's talk about this bowing stuff. Okay. Oh, I even had my notes here. Great. Okay, let's talk about this bowing stuff. So I found these great graphics on the internet at jewfaq.org, which has a great animation of a person bowing. So it comes in handy, I suppose. Okay, so the sort of standard bow, similar but not identical to the Baruch Hu bow, involves actually three elements. We bend the knees at Baruch, we bow over at Atah, and we straighten back up at Adonai. So I'll say that once more. So we bend the knees at Baruch, as seen in the top right picture. That person is bending their knees. Bend over at Atah, so we're bending over at the waist, and then straightening back up for Adonai. Now, this bowing is done 3 times in the Amidah. The other bowing instance is a little variation, but we'll talk about these 3 times. The first 2 times are rather easy because you do it at the first blessing. The first blessing is Avot, the blessing for the ancestors. You do it at the very beginning of that blessing and at the end. So when who is ever leading the service, you've done Adonai sifatai tiftach ufi yagid tehilatecha. You've taken your 3 steps back and 3 steps forward. Your feet are together, and the leader goes, Baruch atah Adonai. You bow along with them. Everyone bows there. So again, that's bend the knees at Baruch, bend over at Atah, straighten back up at Adonai. And
Maybe we
then
should practice that.
we will practice.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, no problem.
Okay.
Yeah. Yep. And I'll just say that we'll, at the end of that Avot blessing, where they say something like, Magen Avraham ve'ezrat Sarah. The next time in that first blessing chunk, when you hear Baruch atah Adonai, you bend your knees, bend over, and straighten back up again. So for the first blessing, it's easy because it's when they say Baruch atah Adonai, you do your bend, bow, straighten. Okay, why don't we practice that? I think I had my, oh, very cool. Happened to open up right to the Amidah page. That's always a good sign. So I'll invite folks to rise in body or spirit. Okay. And remember, we're going to start off with our 3 steps back and 3 steps forward. So we'll say, Adonai sifatai tiftach ufi yagid tehilatecha. So when I said Adonai sifatai tiftach, that's 3 steps back, and then 3 forward. Ufi yagid tehilatecha. Feet together. So close together, it's almost like you have 1 foot, like apparently some people thought that angels do. And then I'll be our leader. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu ve'Elohei avoteinu ve'imotenu Elohei Avraham ve'Elohei Sarah Elohei Yitzchak ve'Elohei Rivka Elohei Yaakov Elohei Rachel ve'Elohei Leah. Bear with me for just a moment. I'll go through the liturgy. Keep your ears open for Baruch atah Adonai. האל הגדול, הגיבור והנורא, אל עליון, גומל חסדים טובים וקונה הכל, וזוכר חסדי אבות ואימהות, ומביא גאולה לבני בניהם, למען שמו באהבה, מלך עוזר ומושיע ומגן. ברוך אתה, אדוני, מגן אברהם ועזרת שרה. All right, you did it. You've gotten half of your bows done, I think perfectly. Any questions about that so far before we touch on the other bow places? Okay, so remember there's a couple elements to it. We start off with our 3 steps back, 3 steps forward. I think I've heard someone refer to that as the tefillah shuffle. I don't know if that's helpful for you, but if you like to think that you're doing a little shuffle or a boogie, you can do that. And then feet together, and then the first words were Baruch Atah Adonai. So that's your cue. You're bending over and up, and then remaining standing until you hear that same tune again. Melech Ozer U'Moshiach U'Magen. Baruch Atah Adonai. Magen Avraham Ve'ezrat Sarah. Now, the thing about the Amidah is that, as we've talked about, there's a lot of blessings contained in there. And blessings, as we know from our first class, always have this formula, Baruch Atah Adonai. You're going to hear, if you're at a community where they're reciting the Amidah aloud, you will hear a lot of Baruch Atah Adonai. And unfortunately, for the rest of them that you hear in the Amidah, only one of them has a prescribed bow at. So it would be great if you could just bow this way to every blessing. Personally, I think that's fine, and I think it's great to bow. It's a great embodied practice. But it is one of these weird things of tradition that, especially if you kind of just grow up imitating what you see people do, a lot of people just bow whenever they say Baruch Atah Adonai. Like I said, it's fine. It's fine by me. I encourage it. But the tradition is that there are these 4 times. So you've done the first 2. And then blessing number, let's see, let's go back to our chart here. Blessing number 18, the Modim, 18 on a weekday, or 6 on Shabbos, Modim, that's when your next bow comes. So there's a fair amount of praying that will go on between your first formal prescribed bow and your next one. So like I said, personally, I think there's no problem with bowing at the unappointed times. But if you're someone who just wants to do it by the book and you don't want to do any extra, or you, for whatever reason, maybe your mobility is limited and you want to do the bowing where it's traditionally prescribed, but you aren't able to bring yourself to do it in extra elements, you can know that there's only 4 times that are prescribed. So the Modim is another time when a bow is prescribed. Interestingly, this one is just a straight bow over from the waist. There's no knee bending that goes on. I wish that I included it in the slides to show you the text for it, but maybe we'll revisit that next week. Or I could find it now. Okay, so I'll just show you, and we can revisit it later or next week as well. Oops. So the Modim bow is, this is if you have the Reconstructionist Shabbat Siddur looking at it, you can look at page 100 for, they call it Hoda'ah, which means thanks. But if you can read Hebrew, again, plenty of us cannot. The first Hebrew word here says modim, which means we are thankful. And so you do a straight bend over from the waist. Modim anachnu lach she'atahu Adonai Eloheinu ve'Elohei avotenu leolam va'ed. So now I'm bowing just to get back in the frame. So we bend over at the waist where it says Modim anachnu lach she'atahu, and you can straighten back up at Adonai. I think that's the custom. I actually usually remain bent over until I say leolam va'ed. So at the end of the sentence. And the translation, which again next week we'll get into the meaning of all this. But the translation says, the translation is, we are thankful I'll just read it from the translation here. We give thanks to you that you are the all-merciful, our God, God of our ancestors, today and always. And so we bend over straight from the waist without bending the knees and straighten back up. And then if you see in the Siddur, the prayer continues for a whole kind of paragraph. And it goes on. And there's a whole thing about, oh, if it's Hanukkah, say this part. And if it's if it's Shabbat Shuvah between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, say this other thing. Thankfully, a lot of Siddurim tell you the instructions like that. But the Reconstructionist Siddur, unfortunately, doesn't tell you when to bow. So that's, I think, another problem. But the other place to bow is just at the end of this Modim prayer, where I'll hold up this, not sure if anyone can really see it or not, but it says, V'kol ha'chaim yoducha salah, v'halalu et shemcha be'emet, ha'el yeshutenu ve'ezratenu salah. Baruch ata Adonai, hatov shimcha ulechanae lehodot. So we have another Baruch ata Adonai, where we bend the knees at Baruch, bend over at Ata, and straighten at Adonai. Okay. That was kind of a whirlwind, I know. So I see Bobby has a question. So Bobby, what's up?
Well, yeah, what's up? That's a good one. I noticed that in all of these, we straighten up with Adonai, which means God. So is this a sign of humility? I mean, I was taught one of the biggest things is you don't bow down to idols when I was a kid, all this other stuff. And so I feel stuck in my head about the rising up with Adonai. So maybe it is about humility. I don't know, but I was going to ask you what you thought.
Yeah, so I think that's a good point. So I think that we'll get into a little more of this next week too, but I'll say for now that I think that the attitude is, there's both the desire to humble ourselves, which is often embodied as lowering ourselves, humbling ourselves before someone, but then also standing at attention.
Okay.
So that's kind of the attitude as well. That's like, you wouldn't, people demand your respect. They say, look me in my eyes when I'm talking to you, that kind of thing. And so, if we are, this tradition is one that is heavily reliant on God as king, Melech HaOlam. And so you're standing in front of the king of the universe. And so you want to be firm at rapt attention. So I think that that's kind of the gesture that goes on, is that there's a bowing for the sake of humility, but then a straightening that comes up as sort of the conversation continues. Yeah. Other questions so far on the bowing? Okay, so again, your cue is hearing that Baruch Atah Adonai, or if you're encountering it in the text, you may be singing it or saying it. It's worth noting that a lot of people, when they're praying by themselves, they may rely on sort of cantorial melodies. They may rely on what's called nusach, a tradition of just kind of sort of chanting traditions. Or they may just be sort of whispering the words to themselves, Baruch Atah Adonai, in that way. And I'll say, if I haven't mentioned it before, that this Amidah, by the very traditionally observant folks, people have a tendency of saying these prayers light speed, mumbling through the prayers and going fast, 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 which is a certain approach that I think to me, there's pros and cons to it, but we'll talk about that more next week. Other questions? Yeah, Sarah.
Oh yeah. Okay. So when you're, in the temple or at the synagogue and, people start the, Amidah and then what are they actually doing then? I mean, we've already established that they're not doing those 17 prayers. So what are they doing then for all that time? And I'm spacing out, what exactly are we doing then? We're not doing 17 prayers. Are we doing the 3, the 6, the 7? What is it?
Yeah, so if you're in synagogue on Shabbat, you would
Yeah.
be saying 7 prayers. Now, the first 3, in a lot of communities, the first 3 are done out loud. So you have
They're out loud and then they're still spending a long time.
yeah, so the
yeah.
first 3 would be out loud, and
Yeah.
then the final 4 would be
Or silent. Yeah.
would be silent. So folks
Oh.
would be theoretically, folks would be reciting the liturgy to themselves,
Mm.
and then also incorporating personal prayer and meditation once they finish the traditional liturgy. In practice, what people are doing really runs the gamut, depending on the community and where you are. Although I will add that the Amidah, according to Jewish law, the Amidah is not to be interrupted pretty much for any reason. So it's a very sacred time.
Well, when I go to I've gone to Beth Shalom or Beth Israel or something, the one on Washtenaw,
Mm.
and they're doing, and then a lot of the guys are doing the bowing and, and, but I always go, it's always on a Saturday morning. And so it's just I'm still clueless as to what exactly they're doing. What are they saying? Where do I find this?
Yeah, so the way to find what they were saying would be that they are, for the most part, what they're doing is reciting the traditional liturgy. So if it's a Saturday morning service, we know that that's shacharit, that's the morning service. And so you could look in a siddur for the section that says shacharit, Shabbat morning, Saturday morning service, that kind of thing. And if you go to the Amidah for there, they would be reciting the prayers as they are written. Softly speaking the words to themselves or sort of reciting them in their mind. And yeah, so that's there. They're kind of working through the 7 blessings. Like we said, that there's the first 3 of them are often said out loud, so they'd be doing the remaining 4, and then inputting personal prayer and stuff like that. Yeah, I'm not sure if that got to the heart of it, but we'll talk more next week about the kind of what are we even doing? What is prayer? That kind of stuff. Because I think the Amidah is a moment where really that's a moment where we should be rather grounded in our sense of what is prayer and what we're doing.
I have a question. What's the etiquette about the end of the Amidah? Because sometimes when I've been involved in more of the organizational part of a service, and that you need to be getting to announcements by a certain time, and then there might be somebody who's seems to be out of step with everyone else standing for a really, really long time. And so what's supposed to happen between the time when you're done and when that very last lengthy person doesn't sit down? And also what's the etiquette of kind of bringing that to a close?
Yeah, that's a great point. So a great question. So we'll use that as our to just address the closing of the Amidah. And then I saw Stacy, and I think was it Raz or Victoria had a question? Okay, let's talk about the closing, and then we'll take your questions. So the closing involves more bowing. So let's just address the bowing portion, and then I'll get to Mary's question. The final words of the Shema are a prayer for peace. Oseh shalom bimromav, hu ya'aseh shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. In certain communities, such as ours, we add in ve'al kol yoshvei tevel ve'imru amen. And this means, may the maker of peace in his heights, in God up in God's heights, who makes peace, may God make peace upon us. Shalom aleinu, upon us. Ve'al kol Yisrael, and upon all of Israel, all of the Jewish people. To which Reconstructionists and others add ve'al kol yoshvei tevel, and all who dwell on earth. And let us say Amen. And there's a little bit of choreography here, that just as we started the Amidah with 3 steps back and then 3 steps forward, we'll take 3 steps back at Oseh Shalom Bimromav. We'll bow to the left while we say that. Hu Ya'aseh Shalom Aleinu, bow to the right. And then forward, Ve'al Kol Yisrael, Ve'al Kol Yoshvei Tevel. We straighten up, and we take or actually, what a lot of people do is, while bent over, they take their 3 steps forward and straighten back up. Does that make sense? So it's another little shuffle, except this time we've got left, right, forward, back up. You may even see some people, when they take their 3 steps forward, they do a little tippy toe, sort of upliftment. So let's practice that, and then we'll hear Stacy and Victoria's questions. Okay. So I'll also say that this is the custom that the Kaddish also ends with Oseh Shalom Bimromav, this same prayer. And so this custom is replicated in the same way for Kaddish as well. Okay, so we're doing our Amidah. I'm going to try to hold this computer. We're standing with our feet together. We bow and take 3 steps back. Oseh Shalom Bimromav. Hu Ya'aseh Shalom to the left. Aleinu Ve'al Kol. I'm sorry, it's hard to do this back and forth. Oseh Shalom Bimromav. Hu Ya'aseh Shalom Aleinu Ve'al Kol Yisrael. Ve'al Kol Yoshvei Tevel Ve'imeru Amen. 3 steps forward. Maybe a little tippy toe bounce. And then we can return our feet to, standing the way that we would normally stand without being all together. Okay, I was a little rough on my choreography there, but how was that for everyone? It makes sense? Okay, I see some thumbs up. Okay, so to address the other part of Mary's question, so as you may or may not know, when you're done with the Amidah, you can have a seat. In a lot of communities, people might wait the service leaders might be waiting for everyone to be done with the Amidah before continuing with the service. In more traditional communities, it's sort of known and understood the various customs around how you should keep going with the Amidah. If you're not done yet, basically you're supposed to finish. You're not supposed to abridge your Amidah. You're not supposed to say, oh, I only got to the middle and the rest of the people are moving on. So you're supposed to take your time, and the service will move along without you, and you catch up, because there's other stuff that is less important that you can skip. But the Amidah is not something that you should abridge or clip off. So from the very traditional perspective, the service leaders might, even when they're finished with the Amidah, they might wait a bit for others to finish, but they're not going to wait till everyone is seated. And there's actually, it can make for kind of a bit of tension to be in a community with people of differences of practices and orientations to this kind of stuff, because I might be someone who, I go to shul, I love davening with people around me, but when it comes to the Amidah, I like to take my time on every word and really feel it in my heart, and I'm there connecting with God, and I'm just doing my thing. And the people leading the service might be, they're looking at their watch and saying, we got to have Kiddush before, 1:30 or something. In our case, it would be like, we got to finish before 11 or noon. But so it can be kind of confusing, because I might be used to communities where the norm is everyone takes their time, and the service leader will keep everyone moving, but there won't be a pressure for individuals to finish. Whereas communities that are, and that's the case with traditional communities, is that there's a lot more empowerment and sort of structure for parallel play, that people are kind of doing their own thing and coming together at certain times and then doing their own thing. It tends to be the case that in more progressive or so-called liberal communities, that Jewish worship is a rather different thing. Rather than being about parallel play, it's about something that we're all doing together. So I think there's a lot of interesting enlivening aspects of that parallel play approach. But it only works when people kind of know what's going on and what the rules are. So hope that clears some of that up.
Yeah, that's super, super interesting. Super interesting.
Yeah, cool. So I'm just looking at the time. I think we do have time for a couple questions. I don't think there was other content really for me to cover tonight. Stacy, what you got?
Okay, two quick things. One, I can't wait till we have in-person services so I can watch, because I'm kind of like a monkey see, monkey do person. And I need to see what other people are doing, because I'll never remember like, oh, this is said and now I do, sitting here at home trying to do it. So anyway, thank you for explaining all this, because I never knew. And then my other question will probably be better asked for afterwards, is like, why is the Amidah so beautifully displayed? Like this, and in other ways, there's like, I don't know if you got into that at all, but anyway, so that might be for later, but it's always like really pretty.
Yeah, that's a great question, and a great point. Let's hear Victoria's question, and I'll see which to respond to and in what ways. But I definitely want to touch on that.
I'm going to wait for my question till after, if you promise to call on me first.
Okay, well, I'll answer Stacy's now then. Yeah, so what Stacy pointed out was that there is this custom of what's called a shiviti, which comes from a biblical verse, Shiviti Adonai lenegdi tamid. I have set Adonai before me always. I've placed God in front of me always. And so, hearkening to Sarah's comment about mystical traditions, this biblical verse, I have set God before me always, for the mystics means really like you should be envisioning the divine name in front of you always. Sort of overlaid almost in like an augmented reality way, seeing the letters of the divine name. Shiviti Yud He Vav He before me always. So that so there's this idea of cultivating that kind of mindfulness. Now, to aid in prayerfulness, there's also this this object of material culture called a shiviti, which sometimes is a painting or a print or a wall hanging or a tapestry, something like that. And it includes the words of the Amidah. Sometimes it includes just that verse or just the divine name, but often the words of the Amidah, because of the sanctity of that prayer, that it becomes kind of a meditative aid and a place to kind of direct your focus. And it's a religious icon for a tradition that is iconoclastic or aniconic. So Judaism, of course, in the Ten Commandments forbids the production of graven images of God. And so, well, we can't really, it's prohibited by tradition to be drawing pictures of God. And so how can we sort of attune ourselves through graphics to remembering the divine? And it's through calligraphy. And so that's a reason for that. The Shiviti, a beautiful example of material culture. They're sometimes also called, related to this concept of a Mizrach. Mizrach means east, because one thing I guess I forgot to mention is that Jewish prayer, traditionally you face towards Jerusalem while praying. And so generally people in the Western Hemisphere just face east rather than relying on a compass or an app or something. We just kind of do cardinal direction of east according to the room that we're in. But this ritual object of the Mizrach or the Shiviti would go on the eastern wall as a kind of meditative aid and a way to know, where should we be praying to? East. Praying to that wall. Okay, folks. Well, it's just about 8:30 now, so we covered what I had set out for us, which is great. Again, tonight's session was focused more on the keva, the structure of the Amidah. Next week, we're going to be learning about the intentionality of it, and also just kind of going through, practicing praying the Amidah together, and touching on various aspects of it. So I hope that this felt like a worthwhile session tonight. Thank you for accommodating our special time. And we will see you not this coming Wednesday, but next Wednesday.
Thank you so much, Jake.
You're welcome.
I really appreciate everything you're teaching us. Are you a rabbi student now?
No.
Oh, okay.
Not
Are you
a
going to
rabbi,
become
not a
one?
student. TBD.
Okay, right
Yeah.
on. Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we'll see y'all next Wednesday, which will actually be Hanukkah by then. So
yeah,
that'll be fun.
okay.
All right.
Thank
Take
you.
care, everyone.
Thanks, Jake.